Today we are starting off looking at Chapter 7 from our Democracy and Media textbook. And this is an interesting case because it's the United States. And many of the other cases that we look at in this text are about democratization. States moving from authoritarianism to democracy. This chapter, though, is a little more theoretical with some current implications about what's happening in the US. But are the media that the US has good for democracy? And what effects does news have on democracy? It's a really important question for us. So let's start off by thinking, what is news? And we have a definition for it. News is the product of a conversation, a set of informal, subjective rules put together by those who gather it, those who produce it, and those who transmit it. So news, the production of a conversation, what does this mean? Well, it means those three groups that we just named, they talk about it, about what news should be. And I'll go ahead and tell you, in this book, news tends to be what is new and what is surprising. Now, we'll talk about that more in a second. But let's think about these three groups. Those who gather news, journalists. Those that produce news, editors, chief of staff, managers. Those that transmit news, corporations, and the people who own media corporations. So journalists, editors, and owners come together to decide, of the things that are new and surprising, what's most important for them to tell the people. That's news. That's how news is generated. So why focus on things that are new and surprising? Well, if you're going to call it news, you have to have new things. And why surprising? Well, if you're reporting stuff that people already figure is going on in the world, they're not as inclined to be as interested. They want something new, flashy, that's going on. So news has to be new and surprising. And so, three things that we're going to move on forward through and think about. News as the game, news and the effects of negative news on the population, and the limit of media-centered politics, meaning what role in politics do media play today? So news as the game. What are we talking about here? What is the game? Well, it's the answer of a series of questions, really. So first, what's the purpose of media? Let's think about that. Well, the Japan chapter talks about media should act as guard dog, guide dog, watchdog, lapdog. But let's put it in different terms. Media in a democracy today are supposed to inform the people. But are media owned and operated by government or privately owned and operated? For the most part, in the US, they are privately owned and operated. They are businesses, corporations. So when you think about what's the goal of media as a business, you cannot say the goal of media is only to inform, because media are businesses. The goal of any business is to make money. Right? Now, you can have multiple goals in there, but somewhere in the mix, you have to talk about media in the US as corporations. And as corporations, they have bottom lines they have to meet. So, yes, you want to inform the public, but at the same time, as a business owner, you have to make money. So, how do you do that? How do you make money in news? Well, you need viewers. You need people to watch whatever you are producing. So you need things that are new and surprising, of course, but is that enough anymore? Short answer would be no. In many cases, we find that news and news consumers in the US, very much like today, infotainment. That middle ground between entertainment and hard news, sometimes called soft news, late night talk shows, morning talk shows, news commentaries, guest interviews. They want more interaction, taking questions off of Twitter or Facebook. Infotainment has become huge in the media market in the US today. And that has been one way that they have used to attract audiences to help make money so that they can provide information to the public. Again, you can't have the conversation about what media and democracy are in the US without also looking at that part of it. Because in order to keep doing what media are supposed to do, they have to keep up with revenue. All right, so how do you continually do that? These kind of broadcasts today are getting very, very sophisticated, very technologically advanced, very expensive. So what do you do? How do you keep attracting more and more people and keep them on your channels, on your web pages, reading your papers, listening to your radios? One easy question with an easy answer: the 24-hour news cycle. If you can produce new and surprising and entertaining news 24 hours a day, you are more likely to retain your audience for longer, in comparison to losing them to something else on television. All right, so this is all a big part of the conversation that is going to be really important moving forward in the next couple slides. But something else this chapter points out is that at one point in time in the US, it was generally thought that reporters are impartial when covering the game. And now we're bringing politics into the game. So covering news, politics are part of news. It used to be that corporations, media corporations, were impartial because they wanted to try and reach as many consumers as possible. If you're biased in one direction or another, you're going to alienate part of your audience. So a question for us: do we still find media in the US today impartial and non-biased, non-partisan? And that's where we're going next. So as we've talked about before, and to address a question from last slide, are media today still non-biased? And of course, our short answer is no, they are definitely biased. They're definitely partisan in different areas. Well, then, another important question we have to think about then, something we hear a lot of: are media in the US biased towards liberals? Another way you could reframe that question, or rather make it more specific: are there more liberal media outlets than anything else? Because when you look at the spectrum of media, you can find media for any type of political affiliation there is in the US. That's a fact. You just have to look. So then the question really becomes, are there more liberal ones? More than likely, the answer to that is yes. So then the next question needs to be, why is that the case? Well, look at the population of the US. That's a really important thing to tell you. Over 80% of the population now live in urban areas. Right? And when you look at party identification, no one political party has a majority as far as people. However, independents are a plurality of the population, then liberals, then conservatives. We also tend to know that a lot of independents either lean left or lean right. If you take those things together, you take the fact that most of the population live in urban areas, why would news corporations want to go more and more to the left? Remember the bottom line. You are trying to attract as many viewers as possible. Now, you should also think about this in terms of niche markets. It is now very commonly accepted that most media outlets are no longer aiming to get everyone. They're aiming at a particular market on the right, on the left, on the center left, on the center right. But they're aiming at niche markets. And if media corporations realize they can retain more viewers by aiming at niche markets, Then when you look at where the majority of the population are centered in the US, urban areas, then it should come as no surprise that there are likely more liberal media outlets than any others. Because even with independents leaning left, putting together with liberals, they probably make up a majority of the population, especially considering they live in urban areas. So that's a quick answer to why we see bias in the direction that we do. All right, then another big question that we need to think about. Much of the news that we see is negative, no matter what spectrum of politics you were looking at. Media, for quite some time, have been focusing on negative news. So not just new, not just surprising, but negative. Why negative news? Tragedy attracts viewers. People, even though we may not like tragedy, when something tragic happens, it captivates our attention. Now, this is not a political psychology class, so I'm not going to go into why. But that's just what we have observed. So what are some of the effects of constant 24-hour cycle negative news? Well, we have three very particular ones. Number one, heightens mistrust of government. If media are constantly reporting on the corruption of government, more and more people will be disgusted with politics. Number two, misleads the public about social trends. What does this mean? If something is hot on the news and people are viewing it, then it gets spread everywhere for quite some time. It takes over the news cycle. Even if other important things are happening around the world, people domestically are focused on whatever is hot at that moment in time. So what we've seen is also a lot of viewers in the US, they focus on domestic news and the domestic news cycle. And it leads the trend to think that there's nothing else happening in the international realm. There could be some pretty big implications about that. And then decreases presidential approval rating. Why would this be a big thing? Well, the president is the most focused on politician in the country. As such, all presidents get a lot of negative news. Their approval ratings go down. Congress tends not to want to work with as much a president with not good approval ratings. People who think politics is all corrupt have a tendency not to want to vote. People who are voting based off of social trends that really give you misconceptions about what's going on in the world aren't that informed of voters. So we're talking about decreasing voter turnout. We're talking about voters voting that are not really informed, and gridlock in DC. Three major effects on democracy because of negative news, because of the 24-hour news cycle, because of news as the game, because news as partisan politics. So let's keep going with this and see what our author really thinks about media in the US and democracy. As a media and politics class, one of the most important questions we should be asking: are the media we have good for democracy? We critique media systems all around the world. It's only natural that we come back and do it here. So, are the media we have good for democracy? What does our author think? To quote them, interpretive journalism rests on the fiction that journalists are in a position to evaluate politics in a way that suits the public's need. Think about that statement. Interpretive journalism rests on the assumption that they are doing what is best for the people. The author thinks clearly media right now, even 20 years ago, were not the best thing for democracy. That the system we have in place, corporate media, be it free and independent, but that corporate media are not serving the people's interest as best as they could be. Now, the author is not stating that Russia has a better media system than the US. They're not stating that China has a better media system than the US. They're simply stating we could do better. and that the media system we have, with the 24-hour news cycle, with negative news, with infotainment, it has some real negative effects on democracy. And then we should think about that. Now, so to you in the forums, what do you think? Is the author right? Is the media system that we have in place good for our democracy?